Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's London Speaker Bureau webinar. We hope you're all still safe and well, and thank you for taking the time to join. Today, we are delighted to hear from Dr. Gabrielle Walker and Ed Gillespie, who will be using the time to talk about the Covid-19 crisis and the climate. Dr. Gabrielle Walker is an expert strategist with a focus on sustainability and climate change and their impacts on energy, finance, and transportation sectors. She is the author of 4 books, including co-authoring the best-selling book, The Hot Topic, How to Avoid Global Warming While Still Keeping the Lights On, and has taught at both Cambridge and Princeton universities. Ed Gillespie is a keynote speaker, writer, communications specialist, serial entrepreneur and futurist, and the author of Only Planet, a flight-free adventure around the world, and the co-founder of Global Goals Accelerator, a business program aimed at delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. Gillespie is a facilitator with the Forward Institute for Responsible Leadership, a board member of Greenpeace UK, a trustee of Energy Revolution, and alongside fellow futurist Mark Stevenson, is one half of the Futurenauts, doing live shows and podcasts on pragmatic optimism. If you have any questions for our guest today, please use the Q&A function as always. And with that, I will pass it over to Gabrielle and Ed.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for inviting us along to this. And we're going to chat, right? Ed, why don't you give us some thoughts about COVID and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, so we'll just spend a couple of minutes with a few opening comments and observations. I mean, obviously you can't talk about anything these days without prefacing it with COVID-19. If you're offering free hugs in 2019, you look like an empath. If you're offering free hugs in 2020, you look like a sociopath. So we're definitely in a very different world. I have been talking about this as the apocalypse, actually, but not in the sense of Armageddon and doomsday, but as in the original etymology of apocalypse, which is the drawing back of the veil, which is the process of the revealing, the revelation of actually seeing the world as the way it actually works, which has blown away quite a few of our comfortable delusions, quite a few of our comfortable assumptions, and actually questioned a lot of our orthodoxy in terms of our thinking. And my job as a futurist is not to predict the future. I always discuss it as it's about stretching the imagination of the possible. And this is definitely one of those moments where the imagination of the possible is being stretched, because the scenario we find ourselves in is not an unimaginable future. Sir Martin Rees, the UK's astronomer royal, way back in 2015 said, a pandemic in our interconnected modern world would very quickly overwhelm our existing healthcare system when the fatality rate was less than a fraction of 1%. And he was totally right. And that's why we've had this lockdown. Also, the All England Lawn Tennis Club has been quietly paying £1 million a year pandemic insurance for the last 17 years and has just received a £100 million payout. Now, someone has made the argument at that board for the last 17 years to pay a very expensive perceived insurance premium, and now they must be, if not laughing, but at least be going, well, that was justified. So this is not an unimaginable future. And I think when you start to bring the two COVID and climate change bits together, for me, it's about a succession of waves. We've been hit by COVID-19. We're now getting the second wave, which we're now starting to talk about in earnest in terms of the economic implications, where, Greece in its own financial crisis a few years ago, when it nearly bumped itself out of the EU, lost about 10% of its GDP. Well, the UK is facing a 20% loss right now, just to put it in context. We've had a sticking plaster of furlough, which has been holding things together, but I think we're about to start hitting the really bumpy territory as the reality of the aftermath of this shock starts to hit. And then, of course, the third wave coming along is climate. And the point I want to make on that is, just before COVID kicked in, we were all staring aghast at Australia on fire. Where an area the size of Austria burned, 500 million animals were killed, thousands of people's homes were destroyed, hundreds of lives were lost. It was pretty shocking. And what we're facing here is this transition, if you like, from simple, predictable linear trends, which in Australia were increased temperature, reduced rainfall, austerity cuts to fire and forestry services. And you bring those three things together, and then combine them through a tipping point, and we get these non-linear, exponential, chaotic, uncontrollable effects, which are these uncontrollable mega fires, which rage beyond our ability to stop them. And that's not really in the models. So the point I want to make is that we've been telling ourselves 3 comfortable myths: that we kind of know what's going on, that we're in control, and that we have the right leadership in place to be able to manage it. And actually the uncomfortable truths are, we don't really know what's going on. This stuff is coming at us in unpredictable and fairly erratic ways. Even the climate scientists are scratching their heads. We are very much not in control. That's our own hubris. And thirdly, our leadership is going to be extremely challenged, as I think it already is. And I would throw in the Arctics, the Siberian temperatures of 38 degrees this week as an example of that. But then to end on a sort of up point, before I hand over to you, Gabrielle, so it's really serious. This is like knife edge type of stuff. But at the same time, there is an incredible opportunity that comes out of this. We're all familiar with the concept of flattening the curve now, in terms of reducing the number of incidences of COVID in order to allow our health system to cope. And essentially what we're having to do now is flatten the curve on climate and sustainability. How do we bring ourselves back in to the carrying capacity of the ecosystem in which we are an integral and indivisible part? And how do we do that without destroying our economy and marginalizing and exacerbating inequality, in another way? So I would say we have this incredible opportunity to build back better in this new economic recovery. The race to net zero has begun. I don't think that destination is in question. The debate now is how fast we get there. What I'm excited by, and what I think is extremely inspiring for me, is where the disruptive, non-linear innovation might come from. In the same way that we get these exponential, non-linear negative effects, we might get these exponential green swans, as John Elkington calls them, that might help us transcend and traverse this madness faster than we might otherwise believe. That's probably enough to start with.
I'm glad you ended on a positive note instead of handing me over the doom and apocalypse. So. Yeah. Thanks very much, typically brilliant, Ed. I think when all of this hit, I remember in January, as you say, we were all aghast by the fires, but also there was the World Economic Forum, and their extraordinary things, climate-related risk being at the top. In fact, all environmental risk being the top 5 risks that were identified there. The financial sector saying this is now mainstreaming. The accountants who know that accountants are going to be the heroes that will save the world, saying we're the ones that have to do the rationalizing of this alphabet soup of all the different ways that companies disclose their climate risk. It really looked as if 2020, the year of climate change. And then when this hit in February and March, I was thinking, what's going to happen now? We're going to lose the COP meeting that's happening at the end of this year. And remembering what happened in the financial crisis, there was quite a lot of momentum running up to green technologies and all of that. And then the financial crisis hit and everybody just withdrew. It's just like, never mind that. We have to get on with surviving before we can actually do anything else. And the whole thing crumbles. And as exemplified by what happened at the Copenhagen meeting that year. And so I was thinking, is it going to be the same? And I have been astonished by what's happened in the last few months. And actually delighted, obviously not delighted about the whole COVID stuff. It's been horrifying. But at the same time, the message I've been getting, I've been talking to very senior executives in oil and gas companies, in extraction companies, in consumer goods, in banks, and they have all, without exception, said, this is accelerating our transition. This is reinforcing our strategy. We are not slowing down, we are speeding up. And they're actually showing it. I mean, BP has just announced a whole bunch of restructuring, and they said that they've brought forward stuff that they were going to be doing in the next 5 years to this year because of COVID. So I think, it's just sort of interesting if you look at this quote. I mean, thinking about the pandemic was predictable. We knew that one was going to come at some point and it could have these effects, as you said so beautifully, Ed. So just listen to these comments. The risks were uncertain but foreseeable. The risks will affect every consumer and every corporate in all sectors and in all geographies. That was Sarah Breeden from the Bank of England. And then, you know, some of the other things, there are systemic risks, which are material risk to financial stability. We can get sudden abrupt policy shifts as a result of these systemic risks that can cause cause chaos and cause human suffering and economic suffering and social unrest. And all of those things were said not about the pandemic, but about climate change.
Yeah.
We've been talking about those kinds of risks. And now we've felt it viscerally. I mean, I've been talking about these for years, but now I know what it feels like.
Yeah.
I know it's real, and I'm not the only one. And so I think that's a very significant thing. We'll come back to this, but I just wanted to mention that because I've been hearing that we're using this as an opportunity to pivot, like a massive reset from the companies. And the other thing is, when I talked to them, I said, why are you doing it? Why? Partly it's because they felt it viscerally and realized it's true. But partly they said that the pressure from the investors has not let up. If anything, it's increased. And on top of that, there's all of these ESG funds which have been creaming it in during this pandemic, because they're the ones that look at systemic risk. They're the ones that look at long-term governance, long-term strategies, whether companies are actually resilient, and they're the ones that have actually been making the money. So I think this argument that's been going on for years is a trade-off between we can deal with the environment, or we can actually make money and be economically sound. I think what's happened this year has thoroughly reinforced the message, which is you do well by doing good, and if you don't do well, God help you. And I wanted to mention two other things. One is the government conditions, the governments that are putting conditions on the bailouts that so far, I think Canada's doing it, UK is doing it, France is doing it, a few others are doing it, saying we won't do the bailout unless you show, and many of the regulatory banks and the central banks are calling for more of that, but also a lot of development in this whole cost of capital reduces if you're part of the transition and increases if you're not. And there's been talk about that for ages, but this year there's been a whole slew of revolving credit facilities and that are specifically targeted towards show us that you're part of the transition and we'll reduce your cost of capital, not because we're trying to be nice, but because we're protecting our investment. And I think that's a really significant thing. You mentioned net zero. Net zero is everywhere. You know, remember 2 years ago, net zero was this kind of wild ambition. Yeah. And the thought that 2050 was really hard. And now 2050 is the top limit. Yeah. And company after company and government after government, you know, Microsoft has said that they're going to be net zero by 2030. And by 2050, they will have extracted all of their historical emissions from the atmosphere. They will become a historically carbon neutral company. And I think that kind of, it's not just a race to zero, it's a race to zero faster than you can do it kind of message that has gone from being fringe to being totally mainstream. Final point I'll make about all this is, we've been talking about the inevitable policy response. This is something that the Principles for Responsible Investment have been warning about when it comes to climate change. It's like, governments around the world are realizing that this is the case. And by the way, in the net zero commitments, I was checking yesterday, I've been watching this barometer go up and up. If you look at the territories around the world that have made a net zero commitment, so the countries that have made a net zero commitment that house generators, firms that generate GDP. So we're now on 54% of the global GDP generators are based in territories that have set a net zero target and counting. And it's really accelerating. So given that, and given the policy responses that are going to come from that, the governments that have said, we're setting a net zero target, how do we do it? The Principles for Responsible Investment have been warning. They said about the mid-20s, there's going to be this kind of, oh no moment around the world when governments will slam in policies and make it very uncomfortable to make the transition if you haven't already prepared for it, if it's not already part of your strategy. And the other point that I'd make about COVID is we now know what it's like to have that massive kind of catastrophic policy changes just crash on your head. And now there's a lot of talk about how we can make this much more orderly. Go, Ed.
No, but I'm totally connected with that point, because it's the salience point, isn't it? As you mentioned earlier, it's like suddenly it feels real. You know, actually, this is a rather cozy generation's first encounter in the first developed world, whatever we want to call ourselves, with a kind of disruption and a kind of catastrophic threat that a lot of people in emerging economies face on a far more daily basis. And this is a rude shock, I think. It becomes salient. We actually feel it in a much more direct way. I also think the stuff you're saying around the principles of responsible investment is fascinating. And I don't know if you saw the news this week, we're then also giving Tesla a hard time, you know, so, which to me also signifies that the PRI is just showing its teeth more. Saying actually, just because you're doing good doesn't mean you can behave badly. You know, it's like, you know, you've got to do well by doing good and also do it in a good way. You know, you can't be an asshole along the route.
Let me respond quickly to that, and then we'll come, because I saw you, there's loads of things, and I knew, Ed, that we could talk about all of this for hours, but just on the point about the principles for responsible investment, I also know things like Climate Action 100, who have been trying to put pressure on the biggest companies by introducing shareholder resolutions, as you know, in their AGMs. And I'd say that, you know, the same thing has been happening. It's gone from being a sort of few activists to being very mainstream. When BlackRock joined Climate Action 100 in January, and when BP actually started working with them on the resolution and recommending their resolutions to their shareholders, again, you can see that it's a mainstreaming, which I think is an incredibly positive outcome.
Well, Share Action described it this week, you know, in terms of perhaps this tipping point that we're both alluding to from the investment world. They described it as we're passing the point of no returns.
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
Well, no, I mean, but it's kind of true, because suddenly people are looking at it and going, hang on, where's the long-term sustainability in this? And there probably isn't, you know, so that's why when the money does start to move, it moves very rapidly. I mean, there was a couple other things. I mean, I think the point you're making about these abrupt policy shifts as well, I think is really important. And I go back to, you know, my sort of biologist background. I started my career as a marine biologist, and in evolutionary biology, we talk about change, which is constant, but we talk about change in two different phases. There's what you might call phyletic gradualism, i.e., well, change is constantly happening and it's all rather gentle and beautiful, and evolution is happening all the time. Or there's, you know, as you will know as well, punctuated equilibria, where, you know, we get long periods of stability and then boom, you know, a lot changes incredibly abruptly. And I think that is what has forced people's hands, if you like. You know, and I wanted to get your view on this actually, as to what extent with these insider conversations you're having is, you know, within every organization there are not, I hesitate to use the kind of the battle terminology of warring factions, but I think it's fair to say there are competing forces to say, actually, where is the heart and soul of our organization? To what extent are we able to fulfill a genuinely bigger than self purpose? Or to what extent are we like primarily focusing on our shareholder responsibilities to the expense of everything else? And obviously there's some legal constraints there, but, you know, what are the conversations you're hearing or a party of about which of those forces, if you like, is on the up at the moment?
So it's a great question. I have been doing a couple of projects during lockdown that were specifically addressing that were looking at energy transition within a couple of big companies and talking to everyone from the ones at the coalface through to the executive directors and the chairman of the board.
You can't say coalface anymore.
Oh. No, mining is a historical thing, and I think I can. But and what we've been finding, I think, has been really interesting, and I'd say that there's two aspects to it. One of them is, I think, in a lot of companies, and not just the fossil fuel companies, but a lot of companies, there's this what psychologists are calling cognitive dissonance, where there's a kind of, I know in my heart I need to be part of this, but in my head, we have a commercial operation to run, and I can't resolve the two, and it's very painful actually, and so I have to kind of shift my beliefs because I don't have any choices. And I know that might sound a bit woolly, so let me make it concrete. The number of times I've heard people say, "Look, we're not Boy Scouts. We're not an NGO. We're here to make money. That's our it's not maybe our sole purpose, but we still have to do it." And if we engage in activities and strategy that puts us out of business, then we all lose our jobs. The shareholders lose their money. The pension holders lose their investments, and the economy tanks. And nobody wants to see that happen. We're not Boy Scouts. And yet, what I found is that the two things are a real perception of the real commercial risks.
Yeah.
Coupled with a realization of the commercial opportunities. What can you offer your customers that actually mean that you use your inventiveness and creativity and your reach and your ability to do massive projects, and you apply those, saying we can give you a customer offering, we can help you make your transition, we can help you on your net zero journey, we're doing it ourselves, and we offer you this service, we can help you. And when people hear that and start to see it, the excitement is astonishing. There's one guy in a big company, I was talking about this, and when I was saying, you know, there's this opportunity and that, he actually picked up his Mont Blanc pen and he started writing, and I thought that beautiful expensive nib was going to go on fire with the excitement and energy of, I can see a way to resolve these. I'm beginning to believe, not just to say it, but believe it, that there's a commercial opportunity as well as a commercial reason for making the shift.
And that's that sort of jolting out of the complacency, isn't it? I mean, I had a similar situation with the board of a large Scandinavian company in February, where I've been working with them for a long time. And I was asked to come in to basically give them the proverbial kick in the ass. And again, this is pre-COVID actually. So, but pretty much everything that I think you and I have probably been saying for a long time has just been sharpened and exaggerated by this. And
as a quick jump in, by the way, we say holding up a mirror rather than kicking ass, but it's exactly the same thing.
Well,
holding up an ugly mirror.
Why I don't do so much consultancy. When I used to call it insultancy, being strategically rude to clients, and which doesn't always necessarily lead to follow-on work, but does allow you to have the conversations around willful blindness and uncomfortable truths. But and I just left them with two questions actually, which are the kind of questions we ask at the Forward Institute, which was like, I got all of those board members to sit around individually and not to have a discussion, to avoid the group think, and just to spend a few minutes writing down, what do you think's really going on here? So we were talking about, climate, regenerative agriculture, plastic, all the key big issues, biodiversity loss, and then we allowed them to share the discussion, and then we got them to do another individual round of reflection, which is like, well, what does this mean for us? And it's just to bring it, and it comes back to that point you were saying earlier. It's like it's not just a cognitive dissonance; it's a dissonance of the heart. And it's a dissonance of the heart and gut. Your gut instinct is telling you that it's wrong, and your heart has to be sort of either encased in lead or concrete in order to ignore what's actually going on. And we've got this sort of cognitive override, and that cognitive override is in itself in dissonance. And I think what's happening through all of this is it's almost like a kind of collective epiphany that comes out of it. It's like, if not us, and if not now, when? What the metaphor I use is I was doing some work with a big European tourist board when there was no tourism at all, and I said to them, your house has burnt to the ground. You don't have a house. It's gone. It's like in the Australian fires. Now, are you going to build back the same dysfunctional house you had before, that you knew was highly problematic and that you were radically trying to change from a sustainability perspective? Or are you going to build the house of your dreams? Because otherwise, what we're involved in, and you mentioned this in regard to, the 2008 bailout, where we massively missed a climate opportunity and gave ourselves another decade of problematic high carbon growth. Or are we going to do what Darth Vader might call Death Star economics, which is, you build a Death Star, it creates thousands of jobs, but it's a Death Star. Or, do we actually knuckle down and build the house of our dreams as we try and emerge phoenix-like from the flames of the Australian fires and the smoke of the wreckage of COVID?
I think you're right. When you're using terminology like the house of our dreams, I think in the past there has been this sense that if you talk about things like you can have energy and optimism, and you can have your dreams, and they go, yeah, but what about commercial stuff? I'm a hard-headed commercial person. And what I think is really interesting about this moment, and why I think it's actually really going to stick, this massive reset button, is that there's something in it for everybody, in that the commercial risks and the commercial opportunities are there. And even the hard-headed commercial people are relieved and excited to know that they can actually continue in that route and do something that they feel good about. So it turns out that everybody's human, right?
Well, and it's not always that Panglossian thing. So I hear what you're saying. Yeah, everyone goes, great, yeah, Mr. Idealist, come along wanting to believe your 6 impossible things before breakfast. And I agree. I don't think that's true. I think now suddenly you've got to cut through, well, people can see the route out of this. But at the same time, you know, there's a part of me personally which always is a little bit worried about, you know, the inability to connect with the reality of the urgency and scale.
Urgency is a very good word here. I've got a question for you on that, because I know you have more connection than I do. I've worked a little bit. I've sort of spoken to the Extinction Rebellion guys and some of the others, but my work is much more on the kind of corporate and finance side than it is in the movements. And another big trend that we saw this year, I mean, last year we had the children and children's climate movements, the youth climate movement, that's had to close down a little because of COVID, but this explosion of Black Lives Matter. And I think one of the things that I would characterize, what you talked about, a collective epiphany, and I would characterize the Black Lives Matter movement as well as being a collective epiphany. It's been around for ages, and suddenly everyone goes, oh, no, it's real. What they're talking about, what they've been telling us about for years is actually real, and we all feel like we need to do something about it. And that has, it's sort of mainstreamed. And I'm wondering whether it feels like there's sort of something in the air, like we've been hearing this a lot, now we feel it, now we do something about it. So what role do you think that kind of, the energy released by that kind of movement is going to play post-COVID?
Well, I think there's a very tight oscillation in that energy, because I think you're exactly right. Because, I mean, this, if you like, is us all being schooled a bit more in systems thinking, because obviously these things are interconnected. You know, I mean, in the context of Black Lives Matter, it's not just the kind of the criminal injustices which have been going on in the George Floyd sense. You know, there's the health economic injustices. You know, you're almost twice as likely to die of COVID-19 in the UK if you're Black. You know, and that's tied up with all sorts of health and economic outcomes and inequalities. And as I say, I think this is to do with this apocalyptic drawing back of the veil. It's like we've pulled back the sheet and we've looked at the system and gone, oh my God, you know, who built this? And we have to remember that most of that system has been built with good intention. It's not all malign or malevolent or conspiratorial. You know, I think any of us who've worked in the bowels or systems of business and government for long enough will just go, it's cock up, guys, you know.
They were doing their best.
Conspiracy here, because you look around and go, it's more scary to realize that no one's in control of this.
They were doing, not only were they doing their best, but they were also producing economic benefits, which had lifted a lot of people out of poverty, given us an extraordinary life. And also, you know, I think it's the siloed thinking. It's that we've been trained to say, let's reduce it to the smallest level so that we can focus on our own thing. And it becomes very hard to see the big picture. And now it's time for big picture and systems thinking. I just want to say quickly, we've had a question which is sort of related to all of this, which is, will COVID bring home the urgency of reducing climate change, or will the economy still end up being the priority? How can it be ensured that climate change stays at the front of people's minds? And so I'd say that that's what we've been talking about quite a lot of this. And the one additional point I'd make, it says, will COVID bring home the urgency of reducing climate change, or will the economy still end up being the priority? And I would say both. Because the point is, the economy being the priority is one of the biggest reasons why the financial sector, why the companies and why the governments are actually saying, we're not going to let go on climate. We've realized the financial risks implied by climate change. And so climate risk is a risk to the economy. That quote that I said before from Sarah Breeden, at the Bank of England, the risks of climate change will affect every consumer and every corporate in all sectors, in all geographies. Mark Carney, a former governor of the Bank of England, has said something which has just been resonating in my head ever since. He said, you cannot self-isolate from climate change. You cannot self-isolate from climate change. You can't divest from it. You can't move away from risky assets. It's everywhere. And therefore, the economy and climate change, solving it goes hand in hand.
Yeah, and that comes back. I mean, the systems thinking here, I mean, it's a phrase which came out of the civil rights movement, which is none of us is safe until all of us are safe.
Yeah.
And it applies with COVID, it applies with climate, as you're saying, and Mark Carney paraphrasing it, and it also plays out in a societal way. And I think, yes, the economy will have to still be a priority, but I think it could be a very different type of economy. You know, and if you just looked at something like energy, the potential dynamics of a two-way collective electricity system where we all become generators and consumers of electricity and energy in some way, shape or form means it's absolutely fascinating, because it is power to, by and for the people. It's not just us all sitting at the end of a linear industrial pipe provided by the big six, where we have to pay a bill that is shoved in front of us, where we have very little choice in the matter. This is a live, two-way dynamic system. And I think some of the work on, electric vehicles and bringing those in as a kind of collective national battery, where people could be, people are already being paid, when we've got windy days and sunny days. Octopus Energy have a tracking tariff, which means during this spring, people are being paid to use domestic electricity. So I think that kind of stuff, it's a different economy, but it's putting climate and the economy together and saying, actually, there's a better, and there will be some losers. That's the trouble in all of these things. It's not everyone win, 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 win across the board. Somebody has to feel some pain in order for these transitions to be accelerated. And that is where I think the honest conversations need to be had. I hesitate to entertain compensation, because I think many of the people who have to feel the pain should have been feeling the pain and changing earlier. So if they have to feel some pain now, I'm kind of like, well, that's tough. I'm sorry. You've had plenty of opportunity to pivot earlier. I get you're trying to do it now. So yeah, I just think it will be a different economy.
It will be a different economy. I think, if we don't do this right, then if we do this right, some people will lose. If we don't do it right, everybody loses. I think that's the fundamental point. And I think that realization is coming to more and more people. We have a last question, which is, what help do you think SMEs, especially in developing nations, need when it comes to meeting targets? So I think what I find most interesting in here is the role of the individual countries that are setting their nationally determined contributions, and how that's relating to the whole net zero transition. And then the opportunities, I think, that a lot of companies are seeing in being able to make this offering in partnership between the governments in those countries and the corporations there. But specifically around SMEs, one of the things that's really become clear through COVID, and it's something that we sort of knew already but weren't really paying proper attention to, is we have to shorten supply chains and take much more care over supply chains and pay much more attention to supply chains. And I think that's where, when this point about SMEs, it's if I as a company say I'm going to be net zero by 2050, and all my suppliers and all my customers are going to be as well, as many are, and if banks are saying our lending portfolio is going to be net zero, and if asset managers are saying our investment portfolio is going to be net zero, it's not enough just to do that with the big companies. It has to be right along the supply chain. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what new digital technologies can be brought in, what new models, what new way of thinking about this can occur, because now what's happening with the SMEs has a direct impact on whether the company that's made the commitment is actually going to be able to fulfill it, and therefore whether it gets the investment or if it gets a higher or lower cost of capital. So there's actually a direct mechanism, I think, between the SMEs in developing countries and the big corporates in the developed world, and it's about time.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I would just add that this is one of the reasons why I was involved in co-founding the Global Goals Accelerator as well. Perhaps for some of this entrepreneurial startups, when Matthew Taylor from the RSA says, think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. And I think like that. It's not so much, because most of the world is served by SMEs. Let's be realistic. Yeah. It's not just about SMEs meeting targets, but it's about, if you want to find the most exciting growth entrepreneurial opportunities, they come from solving the big problems. And when Gabrielle and I talked about, at a preliminary chat for this webinar earlier this week, I mentioned Tony Saber from Rethink X, because he's been plotting, disruptive innovation and its impacts for the last 10, 15 years. And in 2005, he created a little virtual stock portfolio of the companies that he thought and predicted would be actually massively benefiting from the disruption to come. That stock went up 2,500% over the last 15 years. So that's 25% growth per year. So, and that's from companies solving the big problems. The average US equity fund returned 7% a year over the same time period. So, reiterating our point, the opportunity comes from doing the right thing.
Yeah, they really you know, it's not rocket science. It's you give people what they want and what the world needs, and you'll make money out of it. I think I was really struck this morning. I was listening to one of the EVP for strategy for BP, who said, and I quote, "We want to be a force for good in the world and fundamentally embrace transition." But they're coming back in September saying exactly how they're going to do it. This is BP, and this is the final one really. You know, in all of this, the relationship between COVID and climate. This is Dame Elizabeth Corley. She's the chair of the Impact Investing Institute, which is former CEO of Allianz Global Investors. She said, "We know now we can do what was previously considered impossible. We know now that we can do what was previously considered impossible." And if that's the impact of COVID, it's going to be a horrible experience, but maybe, just like you said, phoenix out of the ashes, some really important and good things are going to come out of it, not just for business, but for the world.
Ed and Gabrielle, thank you so much for that. That's been really interesting and I think overwhelmingly positive. So thanks again for your time and we hope to hear from you soon. And just to let you know, thanks for everyone again for joining. Next week, you will be able to see or hear from Saeed Awarsi. So we look forward to seeing you there and hope you have a good end of the week. Thank you very much and take care.